Today, I'm going to be talking about Electro-Euroatavism, which is a hybrid genre of ancient musical traditions and dark driving electronics that I've created. For decades, I've been interested in music that blends ancient European musical traditions, folk and medieval, with a dark driving electronic sound. Unfortunately, the way musical genres work today is entirely incompatible with this eclectic combination. That's why I've created a new genre, which I call Electro-Euroatavism, that encompasses these characteristics. I chose this genre blending phrase based on the concept of an atavism, which is a noun that means going back to ancestral roots. In this video, I'll introduce this genre, define its characteristics, and let you listen to some examples of this genre's musical artists. I'll also define what medieval music actually is and explain its continuity with the present. So there are a lot of stereotypes about medieval music, but let me start by saying, "Dost thou delight in the music of the Middle Ages, which is wondrous fair and sweet, like unto a maiden of noble birth, fair and pure, dwelling in a castle yonder?" Did what I say maybe capture a little bit of the essence of medieval music for you? Did it make you think of abandoned musical traditions that are not part of a living tradition today? Did you think of simple, plain music devoid of improvisation, melodic character, or any kind of richness? If so, you might be surprised to learn that these are all inaccurate stereotypes. So let me start with what I said in that ye olden language I just spoke, which was my misguided attempt to communicate using medieval words and phrasing. While what I said was assuredly how people did actually speak in the past, it's actually modern English, spoken during the Renaissance, after the Middle Ages ended. But how would this phrase actually have been spoken in the year 1000, during the proper Middle Ages, prior to English being heavily infused with French words? Let me show you. Lycath that sankrafte das middelalders, dat is wonderlijk, fager en swete, swulsche maden av athalan, kunnana fager ad klane, wune ende an castella beyond. So what I just spoke is essentially a foreign language to today's English speakers. But it is English, or rather, it's a really old, archaic version of it. Just like this Old English sentence might surprise you with its authenticity, so might the reality of music during the Middle Ages, which lasted from approximately the year 500 to the year 1400. But before I continue, I should let you know that this video is not about me or my music. It's about defining a new hybrid genre and giving exposure to some amazing musical artists that deserve attention. If at the end of this video you listen to just one of the artists that I mention, I think I've been successful. So let me start here. What do we actually know about music during the Middle Ages and how it differs from modern music today? The reality is that we don't know a whole lot about music during the Middle Ages, especially before the year 1000. The reason is pretty simple. Hardly anything was written down. And even if accurate musical notation was available, the full scope of a medieval performance will always be unknown because of this central role of improvisation. Thus, even assuming we have accurate scores for medieval music, which we do not, relying on musical notation alone inevitably paints an incomplete and inaccurate picture of the music of the Middle Ages. But that does not mean extant written musical notation isn't valuable. It is. But this record is unfortunately rather thin. The modern concept of sheet music, where specific pitches and durations of notes, a key signature, measures, and words in context with the melody, did not actually come together until about the Baroque era, which is about the year 1600. Before then, some degree of interpretation, increasing greatly as you went further into the past, is required due to the lack of complete musical notation. For instance, let me give you some examples here. Note duration was not recorded until the 13th century, and measures weren't recorded until about the year 1500. The result is that, especially prior to the year 1000, there is often a lot more guessing than there is facts. For this reason, some scholars emphasize that it's important to refer to the ancient Greek treatises upon which medieval musicians relied to supplement incomplete notation. With this broader knowledge, it then becomes possible to develop a kind of a theory for how medieval music was performed, especially in relation to improvisation. As Faraji, an expert in traditional European and Middle Eastern music, explains, supplementing extant musical notation with these ancient Greek treatises strongly suggests that ornaments, which are improvised notes that are often not diatonic or part of a 7-note scale, and melismatic singing, which is singing a syllable using several often ornamented notes, were likely to have been a normal part of medieval music. Or in a simpler sense, medieval music might have sounded like what we conceptualize today as traditional Middle Eastern music, or even some forms of modal European folk music. I'll get to the concept of modal music in a moment. This claim makes more sense given that medieval European and Middle Eastern music share a common ancestor in ancient Greek music. The characteristics of traditional European folk music, which evolved from medieval music, as opposed to being heavily influenced by classical music theory, add additional evidence for the ornamented richness of medieval music. Let me give you an example of what this actually sounds like. This is normal singing. This. Thus, the supposedly simple sounds of medieval music, confined only to a diatonic scale, very much appear to be a stereotype. So why is this the case? Faraja explains how musicians well within the modern era only used extant and incomplete medieval sheet music to recreate performances. Because their perspective was not informed by ancient Greek musical practice, such as improvisation and the tuning methods that were well known to medieval musicians, modern musicians had little choice but to rely on classical music theory to guide their recreations. So while not strictly inaccurate, a better word to describe the situation is impoverished. Thus, these performances of recreated medieval music are often essentially sterile, devoid of the improvised, ornamented richness, and authentic tuning methods that would have originally been present. Had these later musicians paid just a bit more attention to contemporary modal European folk music, however, they might have realized that elements of medieval music were still alive that could have informed their approach. To be sure, actually listening to today's modal European folk music to provide evidence for how medieval music was played is critical. While we do know that secular music surely existed prior to the year 1000, there's just no written evidence for it. The only extant records we have for music in this early era is entirely based on religious music sung in Christian churches. By the year 1300, however, some of the first secular or folk songs began to be written down. But even in this latter era, there are only a handful of secular songs that have any kind of recorded musical notation at all. And just like the religious music of the Middle Ages, the notation is often quite thin. So even though our written information is scant, it does paint a broad evolutionary picture of Western music development through the Middle Ages. Prior to the year 1000, it appears that music sung in churches was mostly a cappella, that is, without instruments. The early church frowned on instrumental music, but into the middle and late periods of the medieval era, instruments were increasingly used in religious contexts. Even so, throughout the Middle Ages, in religious music, instruments, such as pipe organs, were typically not accompanied by singing, but rather the performance was alternatum. First the instrument, which then stops, and then singing, but never both together. Thus, polyphony, which is the possibility of more than one musical note sounding at a time, was pretty limited in the medieval era, although some forms of polyphony did exist in vocal music. By the end of the Middle Ages, however, polyphonic instrumental and vocal compositions were being written down, so it can be assumed that their performance was probably pretty common. There is also evidence for polyphony in the form of instruments accompanying singing with early secular or folk music, but again, essentially nothing was recorded prior to the year 1300 of this nature, leaving us to speculate about, what came before. The troubadours and minne singers of the 12th and 13th centuries had a profound influence on the development of secular music, but it's unclear how this might have impacted formal religious music, including the development of musical polyphony. The written record, however, points to Gregorian chants and the introduction of the organum, a second voice sung at the same time with another voice, around the year 900 as the official start of polyphony. By the 12th century, especially centered in Paris, polyphony in music became quite sophisticated, but still lacked important characteristics for tonal music, namely a specific key center and the regular use of major and minor chords in a structure emphasizing harmony. This is what we take for granted and what we expect in music today. The Renaissance, after about the year 1400, marked the turning point in Western music where keys and harmony began to play central roles, becoming fully developed by about the Baroque era. In some, medieval music simply didn't feature keys, chords, or harmony. They just didn't exist at all. To be sure, much of the so-called contemporary medieval music heard today is really, in reality, often neo-Renaissance music because of its embrace of harmony and lack of modal features, which would have been entirely common to authentically medieval music. Because harmony is not the goal of medieval music, pre-Renaissance polyphony is quite different from the kind of polyphony that defines music today. Since the Baroque era, the concept of the major or minor key, which is a specific sequence of 8 plate notes that define an octave, different in where the half steps are placed, and harmony has dominated musical compositions. Modern music is fundamentally about harmony driven by chord progressions, which are 3 or more notes played at once that typically consist of at least an interval of a major or a minor third followed by a fifth. Thus, music in the modern era is conceptually about stacking notes to create chords. Medieval music, when more than one note is played at once, just doesn't work this way. When more than one note sounds at the same time in medieval music, it is often, in a sense, accidental. Rather than music intentionally composed as stacked notes played at once, like a chord, vertically, notes that are vertical, medieval music is best conceptualized as a horizontal affair where different melodies are played at the same time and the notes just happen to sound simultaneously, which hopefully creates a kind of a pleasing sound. When these notes are playing together, the intent was not to create a chord, but rather to, in general, there's some exceptions, avoid overall discordance. But as with much of medieval music, relying on surviving written scores alone to define desirable intervals paints an incomplete picture. Many of the medieval musicians who formally documented their music, including their strong preference for consonant intervals, also wrote about how ancient Greek treatises influenced their performance, which indirectly indicates that their music was intended to be ornamented when it was performed. Because of non-written ornaments, likely added through this process of improvisation, these undesirable intervals outside of the diatonic surely existed in medieval music as it was performed, including augmented intervals in quarter tones, which are definitely not part of the classical music tradition. It's important to note, though, that ornaments were not intended to be the dominant feature of the music. In this sense, the written sheet music of the medieval era was only intended to capture the most important ideas or the fundamental ideas of a musical piece, so that performers then had a great deal of latitude in its performance. They, in essence, had to fill in the blanks. That is the process of improvisation. Because of this high probability that medieval music included ornamented improvisation, some degree of transient discordance was unavoidable and thus had to have been acceptable to some sense. In other words, the expectation that, for instance, a Gregorian chant would never have included a diminished fifth, which is a very discordant interval, seems to probably be inaccurate. On the other hand, it would be fair to assume that a musical piece would not have been built around the foundation of a diminished fifth. Again, that's the fundamental idea. What makes this transient discordance different from what is found in classical music theory is that it wasn't introduced to add tension that would then be resolved with a consonant interval. Rather, ornaments existed to add color, kind of a color to the composition, or flavor. Again, what is assumed in medieval music is that the overall nature of the prominent intervals over an extended period of time in the musical piece were likely to be consistently consonant. That's kind of hard to deny. Although the written evidence isn't abundant based on scores that have survived, there seems to have been a strong preference for consonant musical intervals in this particular order: the octave, the fifth, and the fourth. And that's part of classical music tradition. Those are also accepted to be the most consonant musical intervals. While sometimes intervals of a third did occur, their presence is not so common in the written record, and seconds even less. Minor seconds and diminished fifths were reportedly aberrant. In fact, they were commonly associated with demonic influences based on contemporary authors of the day. Again, this doesn't take into account that in the improvisation, occasionally introduced brief appearances of discordant intervals. They weren't the feature of the music. The sonorous quality in the recorded scores of medieval music is easy to hear through motions like parallel fifths, which might be strange sounding to the modern ear, but were very frequent in polyphonic medieval music. Quick aside here, classical music theory seeks to avoid parallel fifths wherever possible, conceptualizing the sound as weak. So when you hear parallel fifths, it often sounds medieval simply because classical music tradition has rejected them as being acceptable. So continuing, the medieval emphasis on the dominant notes in a musical piece being consistently consonant is different from what is found in the classical music theory. So again, in classical music theory, there is a kind of a dance between discordant and consonant intervals, with discordance driving towards consonance so as to seek a resolution. Tuning was also different in the Middle Ages because the modern concept of equal temperament, which is dividing an octave into 12 equally divided notes, simply did not exist in the medieval period and only became widely used in the Baroque and Classical eras. Instead, two tuning systems dating back to the ancient Greeks were widely used: Pythagorean and just intonation, both typically dividing the octave again into 12 notes and then using 8 of them. But the way that they were divided emphasized a very pure fifth and fourth, so very consonant. That's not possible in equal temperament, along with other types of pure intervals. But other numbers of notes per octave were also used. Again, we're going back to the Greek tradition, which is pretty much not found in most modern music today. When performed, however, chromatic or quarter tone ornaments would likely have been introduced. But again, these were not the dominant parts of the music, the dominant notes in the music. So kind of pulling this together, let me give you an idea of what these different tuning systems sounded like compared to the ubiquity of equal temperament today. Critically, medieval composers did not create their work in what we know today as a key, but rather used what we know today as a mode. A key helps to create a tonal center, which is a single note that a melody or chord progression moves toward. Keys help to establish harmonic structures based on chord progressions, usually either minor or major, that support this tonal center. Keys are consistent in either being minor — there are basically two different flavors of minor keys — or major. A mode, on the other hand, is not intended to support harmony or chords, but rather to create tonal colors between various intervals in a melody. As opposed to a key, the places in which there is a half step, that is, the smallest interval that is normally playable, can vary greatly. Medieval music used many of these different modes, such as Ionian, which is more or less equivalent to the major scale, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, more or less equivalent to the minor scale, and Locrian. With the tuning systems in use, which were not based on equal temperament, there was no possibility then of modulating into a different mode, which is akin to modulating into a different key, because the intervals are not evenly divided across the octave. In simple terms, such an operation would just sound really horribly discordant, and as such is just not found in medieval music. A piece of music is consistently in one mode for its entire duration. But rather than talking in theory about what a mode is compared to a key, let me actually give you a demonstration. So it was the Greeks that came up with this idea to divide up an octave into 12 different parts. And most of these divisions consist of what we call a whole step, which is equivalent to going from a C to a D on the keyboard like this. But in that octave, there are also two spots where there are what we call half steps, which are exactly half of a whole step. And that's equivalent to going from an E to an F on the keyboard like this. And you can think of the half steps easily as the white notes without any black key in between them. And so the Greeks again came up with this idea that they were going to change the position in that octave where those half steps occur to create what they referred to as 7 different kinds of modes. Now, we are already very familiar with 2 of these modes today because they're used in popular music all the time. And the first of these modes is called Ionian. We know that as a major scale. And so we get a major scale or an Ionian scale by going from C to C on the keyboard like this. So again, that's Ionian, which we also know as a major scale. There's also another kind of a Greek mode that we use commonly in popular music, and that's called a natural minor. Now, the Greeks called this an Aeolian scale, and we get that by going from A to A on the keyboard like this. So that is a natural minor or an Aeolian scale. There's a variation on a minor scale called a harmonic minor, which I'm not going to go into, but those 2 types of modes we actually are very familiar with. Now, where the big difference in those modes are, again, where those half steps occur. So if you look at that major scale, where's the half step? It's at the 3rd and the 4th degree of the scale. Where's the half step if you're doing that minor scale? Well, that occurs at the 2nd and 3rd degree. And that's really the only thing that's changing in terms of what's giving these divisions of an octave their particular quality. And so the Greeks went beyond just simply 2 of these modes. There were 5 additional ones. And again, all that's changing here is where those 2 half steps occur in the octave. So the next mode that the Greeks used was called a Dorian mode, which is equivalent to going from D to D on the keyboard like this. And if you listen to that, that is basically an Aeolian mode at the beginning, but it's a little different towards the end because where the half steps occur. The next mode that the Greeks created is called a Phrygian mode, and that's going from E to E on the keyboard like this. The next mode after that is the Lydian mode, which is going from F to F on the keyboard like this. And then we have Mixolydian, which is going from G to G. And then the last mode that we haven't covered yet is going from B to B, which is called Locrian. Locrian's a little weird because, as well as Phrygian, because you've got those half steps, they're coming really early. So if you go back to the Phrygian mode, which is equivalent to going from E to E on the keyboard, the half step is happening immediately. It's the 1st and 2nd degree. It's the same thing with the Locrian mode. And so what happens there is you get a really dark sound that is rather unique. And if you listen to a lot of music in a major key and then you switch into listening to music in a either Phrygian or Locrian mode, it can be a little disorienting because you keep hearing that first degree of the scale wanting to resolve as if it's going to the second degree, as if it's the root. But what you'll discover, as I'm going to show you in a little bit, when you actually do modal compositions, you can reinforce the tonal center even if that half step is happening between the first and the second degree. So that's a very quick overview of what modes are. And the next thing I'm going to do is cover what's the actual difference in a modal versus a tonal, or a composition that uses chords. What's the difference between those two? So to show you the difference between a modal and a tonal composition, I've created a couple of measures to demonstrate the A Phrygian mode and F major, the latter of which shares many of the same notes with A Phrygian. And I'll start with the modal composition. I'll begin with a basic 6/8 beat, and now I'll add a simple melody that emphasizes the first, second, and third degrees of the A Phrygian scale, which are A, B flat, and C. Now I'll add a vocal track I created where I sing melismatically and with ornaments, reinforcing the melody that I've created. With the exception of the ornaments, the only note I've added here is G, which doesn't really set up a harmonic or chord structure, but the transient intervals that are happening here are unisons, seconds, and fourths. So now let's go ahead and take what I've done here, the basic framework of this little two major composition, and turn the modal composition into a tonal one. Specifically, I'm moving from A Phrygian to F major. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the modal vocals that I've created because they're not really going to work so well. But I'm going to go ahead and keep the original melody. So this is where I started with again. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in some chords. Specifically, a progression of the 6, 4, 6, and 1 chords in the key of F major, which would correspondingly be D minor, B flat major, D minor, and then F major. And to really emphasize this chord progression, now I'm going to go ahead and add in a bass line. And this bass line is the notes D, F, D, and B flat. For the first two chords, these notes represent the root of the D major chord and the fifth of the F major chord. For the last chord, adding in that B flat in the bass line turns this chord into an F dominant 7th chord. While I wouldn't use the vocal I created for the modal composition, I could certainly add a new vocal that would be more conventional in reinforcing the chord progressions in this song. In other words, that original vocal wouldn't sound particularly good here. I'll turn it on just to give you a sense of that. Doesn't work. So I'm leaving that out. So there you have it. This is the difference between modal and tonal composition. In terms of rhythm and song structure, medieval music, when we have some idea of a time signature, which is not always the case, used many time signatures from today's common 4/4 to more uncommon signatures, at least compared to today's pop music, such as 6/8 or 7/8. While the notes may be indicated in the documentation that we actually have in the medieval era, the way in which they are grouped to create a rhythmic structure is often entirely unknown. How percussion was used in medieval music can therefore be a bit of a challenge to decipher. And because of the lack of documentation of measures, many times we can only guess how the repetitive units of medieval music manifested, whether they were in groups of 4 or 3 or 16 or 20 or some other number. We just don't know. Lastly, we know a bit more about the particular instruments that musicians used in the Middle Ages, especially in the middle to late periods. These included stringed instruments like the dulcimer, fiddle, harp, lute, lyre, and organostrum, which is kind of like a modern-day hurdy-gurdy. There were wind instruments like bagpipes, clarions, flutes, horns, pipe organs, and percussion such as bells, clappers, cymbals, frame drum, Jew's harp, and pandeiro. Many of these instruments are readily recognizable as progenitors of today's classical instruments, and some have survived in a form that has changed not a whole lot over time. Of note is that some of these instruments, much like modern-day bagpipes today, played two notes at once. There was a drone, which is a bass note that did not change, it constantly sounded, and a melody over the top of the drone. Again, think of like Scottish bagpipes. That drone works particularly well with modal music, which is why these kinds of instruments are associated with modal music. So now that I've covered the basis of what medieval music actually is, let's get into some of the more nitty-gritty. So let's actually get into, shall we say, the mode and define musical authenticity of medieval music through this modality. So given what I've discussed at this point, how much of so-called medieval music made today is reasonably authentic? In other words, if you were to play this music to people who lived 800 or 1,000 years ago, would it sound remotely like something that would have been familiar to them? The answer is probably, as you would imagine, it's pretty complicated, but there are some rather clear cases where calling such music medieval might be a little bit of a stretch. Of all the elements, we do know that definite bona fide medieval music is clearly recognizable because of its modality, as opposed to harmony. And so modality also happens to be the most widely documented aspect of medieval music. So if you were to play music to people 1,000 years ago, it really needs to be modal. If you played them keys and chords and things like that, it would be pretty bizarre to them. Alien, perhaps, is the best way to describe that. Today, looking at what we think of as medieval music today, probably the most egregious use of medieval branding is what is known as the bardcore genre, which reimagines popular songs in a supposedly medieval style. By definition, works in this genre fundamentally rely on harmony and chord progressions, which pretty much they violate a core tenet of medieval musical authenticity based on modality, because they're not modal. They're emphasizing harmony. While the instruments or sounds from these instruments in bardcore, for instance, might be reasonably authentic, this just is not sufficient to actually make the music authentically medieval. So to be sure, as this shows, what I've talked about so far, the boogeyman of medieval music recreation is harmony, which is fundamentally ingrained in Western culture and in the composers who grew up in this culture. It can be difficult for composers to escape its clutches, which makes the novel creation of truly modal medieval music somewhat rare, especially when there are multiple instruments or vocals in the composition. Part of this is that the modal songs can sound a little bit strange or off. They might beg for a missing third or need to have some sort of dissonance resolved through a chord. But musical artists often find themselves having to work against cultural instincts when creating neo or new medieval music. It's not so easy to set these ingrained cultural responses aside. It's actually really quite difficult, especially if you've been trained in classical music theory. You have to actually learn how to violate that theory in a sense. So I would argue that the most important aspect of creating music that has some semblance of medieval authenticity is to assure a composition includes modal elements to some relative degree. We do know with certainty that medieval music up until the very end of the Middle Ages, was quite assuredly modal. Other aspects, however, such as how percussion was used, time signatures, and measures, are just an educated guess at best. While some musical purists might disdain neo-medieval music that is not authentic to the highest degree possible, I think this perspective ignores the creative potential of bringing the past into the future. As for myself, I do not advocate for this obsessive authenticity, which I think is just not necessary for the overall enjoyment of music. While bardcore in my mind is rather a stretch to call medieval, I think it's fair to label many artists' compositions as influenced by medieval traditions if they're somewhere in the spectrum from including a minor amount of modal compositional elements toward basing their work fundamentally on a modal framework. But in this, shall we say, definitional constitution that I've created, modality is more important than the sound of the instruments, or really any other musical aspects in defining whether or not what you're hearing is medieval. So this then brings me to my next point, which is European folk music might then be the most authentic medieval music. Because I mentioned earlier that there's something about traditional folk music that has the potential to inform what medieval music used to be, because there's a continuity between the past and the present that has been brought to us through folk music, European folk music. So as I've alluded to already, modal European folk music might just be the most authentic representation of medieval music that's available at the present. So while the religious music of the Middle Ages died, pretty assuredly, and was resurrected much later by musicians who imposed a rigid classical structure on it, secular medieval music continued in a relatively uncorrupted form, that's the important idea here, to the present via modal European folk music traditions. While contemporary European folk music incorporates classical musical elements to some degree, more or less, when a modal structure dominates, this music, this folk music, appears to, more than any other musical forms today, accurately convey the authenticity of medieval music. That's why you can commonly find the consonant intervals of the octave, fifth, and fourth in many European modal folk traditions, along with ornaments and melismatic singing, which are not supposed to be part of medieval music, but, as I explained earlier, in reality, probably were quite likely present 1,000 years ago. So, what exactly then is modal European folk music? As Europe is a pretty large geographical area, there are lots of examples of modal folk music, including from the following geographical regions. So I'm going to break Europe down in a very general way. There's a lot more examples than this, but this is a very general overview. So in Southeast Europe, or the Balkans, which would be like, for instance, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Macedonia, Greece, there are lots of examples of Phrygian, Mixolydian, and Aeolian modes that are performed by some of the musicians that you see here. In Central Europe, such as the Carpathian region of Ukraine, where there's a variant of the Dorian scale with raised 4th and 6th degrees and lowered 7th degrees, there's examples of this kind of music such as the folk ensemble Hutzel. In Northern Europe, such as you think of Celtic music from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, it typically focuses on the Mixolydian mode. And so some examples, there's lots of artists. I'm just going to throw out a few here. Like think of the music of Atlan, Lunaza, and Boys of the Low. And then you have folk music from the Iberian Peninsula. So you think of like Spain and Portugal, where Arabic microtonal maqamat modes are pretty common, along with Phrygian, Mixolydian, and Dorian modes. And so you have the music of artists such as La Bazanca, Asociación Etnográfica Bajo Duero, Ringo Rango, and Grupo Folclórico de Bañeros, Campanario, and Lenda Artebra. Lots of musicians in this particular region of Europe.
Ay, la clara, tu vuelves sola siempre acompañada. Ay, la luna de enero, a la luna le falta un lutero.
Undoubtedly, there are many, many other general and specific examples that I've missed again. So this is not supposed to be all-encompassing. It's just in general. And personally, out of all of the European folk music traditions I've encountered, I'm most strongly attracted to the folk music from the Iberian Peninsula because of its complex rhythms, syncopation, and time signatures, often pretty unique, especially compared to pop music, expressed through a variety of percussion instruments. And many of these instruments have continued to be influenced by Middle Eastern traditions more so than other European folk traditions. So to me, this music from the Iberian Peninsula is really, really intriguing. But that's not to diminish the other folk traditions in Europe. From my perspective, it's hard not to be mesmerized by all of them to some extent. So now I'm going to talk about something that might seem a little strange, and that is the surprising overlap between medieval and some electronic music. This is probably something that I would imagine that a lot of people watching this video haven't really thought about, but I have, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So I admit that the reason that I'm bringing this up as a subject is I'm pretty partial to electronic music, mostly because the sounds of electronic music really move me emotionally, especially analog synthesis. But as it turns out, music composers and theorists during the Middle Ages were also interested in the relationship between the quality of sound and its impact on the listener. So many medieval philosophers wrote about the impact of sounds and music on people. For instance, Ancius Manilius Severinus Boethius, writing in the 6th century, described the unique timbres of string, water, and percussion instruments, and through a reference to ancient Greek philosophers, their impact on people, the way these sounds impacted people. St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas were deeply interested in the relationship between timbre, modes, and spiritual feelings, viewing music as a way for people to move closer to the divine and the beauty of God's creation. To be sure, many other medieval philosophers, such as John Scotus Rugen, Hugh of St. Victor, and Martianus Capella, viewed the specific sounds in music as a gateway to spiritual growth. Specifically, Albertus Magnus, writing in the 13th century, believed the sounds in music could evoke joy, sorrow, anger, and peace, and even heal the sick. I'm not making that claim, by the way. Although these philosophers did not reduce their theories to specific instrumental timbres, their writings express an important relationship between the sounds of music and their effect on people. So, from today's perspective, many electronic music genres have elements similar to medieval music, especially in relation to modality. A particularly relevant example is electronic body music, or EBM, which arose in the 1980s in Germany and Belgium, with heavy influences from industrial and punk, while drawing from disco's penchant for a steady beat. Like medieval music, EBM features many ostinatos and repetition, but in particular, EBM music is often modal in its use of sustained drones and unconventional scales. Let me give you an example to listen to.
What's there? Getting closer.
Echoing the medieval organum structure, a typical EBM track will have at most two identifiable pitched elements: a prominent droning or modal bass line, Phrygian and Locrian variations are pretty common, and a vocal. So it's harmonically pretty simple. Much like later European folk music from the Balkans or Iberia that was influenced by European and Middle Eastern medieval traditions, the vocal typically will be in unison with the bass line or a minor or major second above or below it to add that kind of discordance that often defines EBM. What is usually absent, however, is a semblance of harmony, chords, or chord progressions. Examples of these musical groups are Front 242, Nitzer Ebb, and Portion Control, but there are also newer artists such as Spark. Over time, many artists that started in the EBM genre, such as VNV Nation and Apoptygma Berserk, have rejected these modal constructions and embraced harmony and chord progressions, becoming more synth pop in character over time, and in the process forging a new genre that most people often refer to as future pop, but I digress. A more recent genre, which is called funk, is known for its Phrygian modality in stabbing parallel fifth intervals. Very, very prominent in this genre. So some of the example artists that do funk include Witches, Kira, and Chord Hell. Like EBM, there's a distinct industrial sound to funk, but EBM and funk to most people would really be a stretch to call medieval, primarily because these genres have an industrial sound that is it's just antithetical to what you might think of as like a more softer or more melody-driven quality of medieval music that has bona fide roots in the Middle Ages. There are other genres, however, with artists that are more overt in the medieval influences. These are electronic artists. And their influences are not only focusing on modal and instrumental qualities, say from the medieval period, but their names that they use for their groups and even lyrics are often in Latin. So some examples include dungeon synth, artists like Nox Arcana, Spellbound Meyer, and Illustris, which are often inspired by medieval-themed games. Darkwave is a genre that also has a number of electronic medieval-inspired artists, especially in the unfortunately inaccurately named neoclassical darkwave genre. Example artists include Love is Colder Than Death, Snakeskin, and Voss, for instance. So many of the artists who are driven to a more authentic medieval sound in their electronic compositions are also considered to be part of a different genre, which is from Germany called, my German is not so great, but I will try this, Neue Deutsche Todeskunst, which translates into the New German Art of Death movement. Some of the artists in the genre, such as Kintel, Helium Vola, and Dinah Laken, have adopted the electro-medieval moniker. Although this is not a common genre name, it does more accurately reflect music that combines electronic and medieval influences than do other kinds of genre names, say like neoclassical darkwave. Kintel is commonly credited, interestingly enough, with creating the electro-medieval name, and the spin-offs from this group, Helium Vola and Dinah Laken, have carried this branding forward. By the way, really interesting artists to listen to if you've not heard them. Okay, so let me bring all of this together and thread the needle, proverbially, through medieval and electronic influences and pull this together, right? I also want to introduce you to my Electro-Euroatavism playlist so you can hear some of these artists. Speaking of that playlist, since the middle of 2024, I've been curating a Spotify playlist of songs from artists that represent all these themes that I've discussed. Primarily an emphasis on modal construction as opposed to a tonal one that emphasizes harmony. So if you want to listen to this playlist, the easiest way to do that is just go into your web browser, type in the word go-genre, all is one word, and then follow that by the very common .com, and it'll automatically take you there. And you can then listen to some of these artists. So that list that I've created, the playlist I've created, is based on my taste, which lean towards other elements found in the European folk music that are derived from medieval traditions. And I'm featuring a lot of electronic folk artists that also use alternative tuning systems, although not all of them. Lastly, I particularly like heavy synth bass lines and intricate percussion with traditional instruments like the folk music from Castile and Leon in Spain. Overall, the songs in this playlist are dark and driving with a sense of mystery, but they are also believably medieval in character. While artists from other genres who use modal constructions, such as funk, which I've mentioned previously, while I do like these types of artists, overall, their sound is overtly contemporary and not believably medieval. Still great music, love the musicians, but it's just too much of a stretch to call them medieval. I would also not suggest that the artists from these other genres are intending to even be identified with medieval. Many of them don't even like that branding in the name. So, and understandably so. In a sense, the best way I could describe the playlist that I've created is what Rune, Viking, Nordic folk, and Balkan and Iberian folk music would sound like with an electronic influence. In other words, the sound is like combining Danheim, Wardruna, and Elnan and infusing their sound with driving dark electronic bass lines and synthetic cinematic soundscapes while keeping their emotive vocals in place. So up here on the screen, I'm going to show you some examples of artists that I've included on the Electro-Euroatavism playlist that I've created. This is just a subset of the artists. There's a lot more. There's more than about 100 up there now. A lot of these artists are not particularly well known. Their plays are well under 15,000 listeners a month. Many are quite a bit less. But they all deserve wider exposure because they're making some incredibly interesting music that's just really evocative of the past, and use electronics to add a mystery to that. It's just pretty incredible. So let me show you what this actually sounds like.
Dice tu madre que tiene. Juntísimos con calientes, Ave María.
So let me conclude this video and briefly talk about where the musical past meets the future. So let me summarize here. Electro-Euroatavism is an enchanting, I think it's a great name because it's sort of like captures the idea of magic, enchanting intersection of ancient European musical traditions and modern electronic sounds. So by exploring the modal nature of medieval music, as I've described here, its later folk developments and its surprising parallels with certain electronic genres, there's now this unique musical space where the past and the future converge. So while the music of the Middle Ages undeniably remains enigmatic, the underlying principles of modality and the emotional impact of known music from this era do provide a solid foundation from which contemporary artists can draw inspiration. And it's this creative process that I'm really trying to emphasize here to make something new and intriguing and emotive. But in all of this, I think it's important to acknowledge that these artists are engaging in it's a kind of a delicate balance between authenticity and innovation. And each artist approaches this in a different way. And I think by respecting this historical context while pushing the boundaries of sound design, these artists have consistently created magical, captivating, and evocative music. Now, go hyphen genre, and listen to some of this music.